Fine. Grant. All right, so today I'm just going to be discussing being intelligence-led and the influence of threat intelligence on cybersecurity. Since it is still quite a new niche, not a lot is really understood about it. So just a brief introduction on myself. I work for Anomaly, obviously. I'm a cyber threat intelligence analyst in the threat research team. So there's about 16 of us on this team. I deal with more of strategic intelligence, so the non-technical side of threat intelligence. So I do more of like geopolitical, social context, looking at the threat landscape and how that influences things. And then the threat researchers do more of a tactical intelligence side of actually looking at malware, the more technical aspects of intelligence. Just a background on myself, I've got certificates in both forensic science and forensic anthropology. I've got a bachelor's degree in psychology and criminology, and then I got my master's in international security and intelligence from both the University of Glasgow and Charles Prague. I have also been just an analyst for a student-led think tank. We focused on strategic forecasting for the state of Iraq for a 5-year time frame. And then I was an intelligence analyst as well for a security and risk intelligence platform focusing on Germany, just kind of what's happening on the ground for organizations to kind of just understand what's happening when they're potentially having like business assets there or traveling there. So based on that, this presentation is just going to kind of give a brief overview of what open source intelligence is, Tradecraft's secrets of just what's kind of crucial for intelligence, and especially within threat intelligence, and then just a real world example of intelligence in action to kind of contextualize it to better understand it. So to begin, what is OSINT? It's just open source intelligence, which sounds complicated, but it's actually not. You're literally just using the internet to look and open source to look up information. So, I mean, the internet is a massive repository of information. You really don't need to look elsewhere for most things. But basically, OSINT utilizes not just Google searching, but also Google dorking, utilizing RSS feeds like Feedly or NewsNow to kind of find information, as well as utilizing academic resources for both peer-reviewed articles and just research that are going on as well. So it's really just an amalgamation of basically anything you can find on the internet, whether it's looking something advanced with an advanced search, or if it's just literally looking up a word and then spawning an investigation from there. So with open source intelligence, you follow the intelligence cycle, which is just what intelligence of any sort really follows. Recorded Future has this lovely circle that it follows, which is lovely in theory, but it doesn't actually follow that. But it's basically just collecting, finding your collection requirements, going through and doing the research, figuring out what it actually is needing to kind of figure out and narrowing it down based on the research question and finding that information, and then just producing it, putting it into a report and then giving it to who it needs to be given to, so the dissemination, and then based on that, giving feedback, which starts the cycle all over again. So not the problem with intelligence, but it's never ending. It's always going, and it always changes. The cycle always stops and goes back to the beginning, after phase 1, depending on the question, depending on the research. You'll always have to change your requirements. You're going to have to change your question. What you're looking for and what you're looking at constantly changes based on the research you gather, based on what you're trying to orient the research question towards. And it just slowly kind of narrows it from a really high top-down picture to then you get to that one centralized question and answer that then you can give to the user, whoever is asking for this intelligence. But the key thing is you constantly have to ask questions. Being an intelligence analyst means you can't just stop. You're always having to pry into things and be nosy. You have to be nosy. That is key. Well, even though they tell us not to be nosy, you have to want to know more. And the internet has so much to offer, and open source feeds have so much to offer that you can always find more information. You just have to continually look for it and also want to look for it. So with OSINT, kind of just understanding what it is, kind of a crucial aspect of open source intelligence is information sharing. I mean, everything we use is on the internet, so it means that the internet and people have to be willing to share that information. Otherwise, as an OSINT analyst, I can't do my job. So it's a fundamental concept to intelligence, whether it is open source or just any sort of intelligence, especially when it comes to threat intelligence. We have to share information, or else we don't necessarily understand what's happening in the world. We don't have a good concept of the actual threat landscape. So with that, it means within information sharing, you have to have transparency between organizations as well as within your own organization. And obviously there are some caveats, because you can't have governments sharing all your secrets, because obviously that would lead to a lot of issues. But there is always some sort of confidentiality. You have to adhere to GDPR. The US Data Protection Act, South Africa has one called POPI, which is very similar. So there are caveats to sharing information, but for the most part, there is some sort of level that you can share your information. And so just a big example of this is the ISAC community, which is an information sharing analysis center that a lot of sectors all over the world are a part of. So you've got the FS-ISAC, which is financial ISAC, which is one of the largest in the world. And this is just showing Europe and its participation, but it's just all over the globe. And this is useful because the globe can kind of share information about what their industry is experiencing and how that might be relevant to another corporation or company. It may be in a different part of the world, but it helps them understand what's happening, so then they can better improve their own cybersecurity and kind of have a better understanding of their own threat landscape to then protect themselves. So it relies on communication, both obviously externally between organizations and teams, but as well as internally. Organizations within their own organization need to share information. So some organizations have a variety of intelligence teams, but they're in different departments of the company, and that still requires them to communicate, because you could have a brilliant technical threat research team, but if they're not in communication with the analysts that are doing a bit more of the strategic intelligence, there's no integrating the two, that you're going to lose information because there's no tying the two in together, which then leaves a company, a government, organization, whatever, very vulnerable. And it's necessary because of intelligence. You need a variety of different people with a variety of different backgrounds. Like I come from an international relations background, but a lot of my coworkers are computer science. You need people from all over the world, from different backgrounds, to create very comprehensive intelligence, just because you need a better perspective. One way of thinking might give you one side of a story, but you need someone else to kind of put a different spin on things and a different way of thinking that might help inform intelligence, and just kind of be like, oh, well, this is going on, but have you thought about why they're doing this, or what this might mean on this side? So it brings a bit more of a comprehensive picture, as well as it creates a foundation for communal knowledge, which is why open source and just intelligence in general is so important. And so on top of that, one of the biggest keys is contextualization within intelligence. So threat intelligence is great and all, but if you don't know what it means, how are you going to use it? You can't. So because with this, information isn't intelligence. Information is great, but if you don't know how it applies to you, and on top of that, what to do with it, you have to make that information actionable in order to make it intelligence, which organizations need, because they've got a variety of information. But if they don't know how to take that information and make a dynamic policy out of it, or how to act upon it, they can't do anything. So it also just gives a comprehensive picture to the threat landscape. So this is my bread and butter, because I'm a strategic intelligence analyst. So I focus on more geopolitics, what's happening in the world, and kind of how this might relate to other organizations, other companies. So I always like to use like the pyramids of Gaza as an analogy, basically, that you've got this lovely, lovely picture, thinking, oh my gosh, it's massive, it's majestic, it's in the middle of nowhere. Oh wow, like they're amazing. But then you realize it's literally just on the cusp of a massive metropolitan city. So it kind of puts it into perspective of like, yeah, on the ground, it's amazing, it looks so secluded, but if you see it from the bigger picture, if you see it from a bird's eye view, it's actually really, really close to everything. So it kind of changes the way you view it, which is really important for intelligence. So you need that context. So myself, with strategic intelligence, we sometimes act as like a middleman between technical researchers and the public. So it's like basically just ensuring that the technical analysis, how this script and code is working and how it's propagating within a system, it's great. But if people don't understand that when you're facing someone who's maybe not technical at all, you need to ensure that someone who's non-technical, maybe has zero idea what you're saying, can understand it, and ensure that then they can then move on with that and do something with it. So you have to make sure that everyone can understand and comprehend what is happening, as well as the implications of it. And it just gives people, whether it's a consumer for a company or if it's just a user yourself, it gives you the ability to be a bit more strategic and just have a bit more of an idea of what the threats are, so then you can address those threats. So this is really important for cybersecurity, because you can't protect a company or you can't protect yourself if you don't necessarily know what your threats are. Even if they're indirect, you kind of have to still have a concept of it. As well as intelligence, threat intelligence also gives the ability for companies to get like recommendations on like a bit more proactive policies and procedures that may need a bit more of immediate response. So like I've done a community threat briefing that it's just a generalized summary of kind of what's happening in the cyberspace that week. So threats and stuff, but you basically just explain it in layman's terms. So anyone reading it can understand, even if they work in marketing for, you know, an advertising company, they can still understand what's going on, and then giving basic mitigations, so then they can also see, okay, well, they fell for this phishing scam. How do I protect myself from that as well? Even though it might not be that exact thing, I might not be getting that exact email. How do I still protect myself if I get something similar to it? So it's just contextualizing it and being able to protect people, whether or not they necessarily need protection from that one threat. Yeah, so basically just threat intelligence in action. A real world application, because threat intelligence, it's a fancy word, but like, what does it mean? Basically, I did a 1-year analysis review on WannaCry, NotPetya, a year after, to kind of just look at how organizations adapted to the incidents. Basically, if they took the lessons learned that were given in both of those incidents and then implemented those into their own policy. So this was completely used off of open source information, academic articles, as well as just the internet. A lot of news sources and cybersecurity experts. And I found that, you know, WannaCry and NotPetya both were preventable. WannaCry, we don't necessarily know how it was initiated, but it's suspected that it was phishing. How do people recognize a phishing email? People could have, you know, avoided this had they not clicked on a dodgy link or allowed macros after downloading an attachment from an email they don't know. As well as they didn't update their systems, you know, patch your system. Some of the SMB exploit that was used in both attacks were at least several months old. And there was a patch released for it 3 months before each attack happened. It was in April, and WannaCry happened in May, and NotPetya happened at the end of June. But there was a patch released and a notification that this patch should be applied. And just organizations globally didn't do it. It's easy. Click yes when it says update your system. But on top of that, not only were they preventable, but still organizations are really slow to adapt their strategies and policies to kind of address these issues. We still have people vulnerable to the Eternal Blue SMB vulnerability that both of these attacks took advantage of. You still have people falling for phishing that are very obviously phishing, of, you know, misspelling an email that you don't recognize at all, asking questions that you don't understand. There's ways that, you know, people haven't yet trained, you know, everyone on understanding what the threat landscape looks like and how to deal with it. As well as they're still not auditing their own security practices. You know, the NHS, which was really impacted by WannaCry, completely shut down a lot of like GP practices in hospitals in England especially. They haven't been auditing their own security practices, so it's imperative to really ensure that your work, like what you're doing, and that the lessons learned are then being implemented, but then you need to go back and ensure that they actually work. Because you can apply it, but if you don't ensure that it's still working, or if you don't test where you might have vulnerabilities, you're still going to fall victim. And that a lot of companies aren't auditing their own practices to see if they're out of date, if they still need to be updated, if they're effective. And that obviously brings companies and organizations and governments, it leaves them very vulnerable. As well as a lot of these organizations didn't have a comprehensive aspect of their geopolitical landscape. You know, when WannaCry happened but affected a lot of the healthcare sector, it didn't really matter for NotPetya because it affected a lot of companies in the Ukraine. But as well, what happened with NotPetya, the malicious update that was sent happened a day before. It happened on a Friday, and it happened the day before Ukrainians' Independence Day. which leads to the suspect that it was likely Russia. But it was quite interesting that it happened the day before their Independence Day. It attacked mainly government infrastructure, as well as organizations that are based in Ukraine, which then spread further. But that was just something that people didn't really understand, is why were they attacked on the day that they were attacked? Well, it's Friday, it's a weekend almost, that people aren't going to work on Saturday and Sunday, so it gives the malware time to go through and kind of propagate further and get more into a system. But as well as it happened on their Independence Day, so who might have something to gain from doing it on their Independence Day? As well as obviously it's just necessary to have policies and procedures in place, especially when it comes to to cybersecurity. We still are slowly adapting to cybersecurity and implementing a lot of cybersecurity policies, because a lot of organizations still don't fully comprehend how it might impact them. But if you've got, any sort of stance on cyberspace, if you have a website, if you utilize, the cloud or an IoT device to conduct a lot of your business, or even just communicate within your own organization, you're vulnerable. So how do we then put those policies into place? What do we need to look out for? What should be the policies to then put in place to be protected? That is crucial, and it's still not necessarily happening. So that's still a lesson learned that we're still trying to enforce, or at least not even enforce, but just let people know that you need to do this. And as well, just kind of a relevant thing that happened more recently is 2019, there was a Siren project, which was an amalgamation of various organizations and some research institutions and universities basically did research that if there was another WannaCry-like attack, it could affect over 600,000 businesses globally, still, in 2019, 2 years after it happened, which would cost organizations between $85 and $193 billion across the world. That's how much it could cost revenue loss, in both revenue and productivity lost, which means, and also the fact that 86% of all of these, $193 billion lost, 86% of those losses were uninsured, in which NotPetya found that a lot of organizations didn't have cyber insurance, so they couldn't recover a lot of their own data. They couldn't cover a lot of the money that they lost in both the incident response as well as customers that lost information, or just the loss of customers, that they weren't insured, and they still aren't insured 2 years later, that a majority of organizations would be out across the world $193 billion. It's quite a lot of money. If I had that amount of money, I would not be I would not be leaving it just open for the rest of the world to take over. Like, you would insure that if you needed it. So that's just kind of threat intelligence in action. It sounds complicated, but it's really not. It's just understanding what's happening and then applying that to your own organization, to your own day-to-day, to ensure that you are resilient, which we all need, whether we're an average person or working for an organization, because us as individuals are still also always vulnerable to threats. So basically, taking all of that information, kind of the key takeaways are there's a plethora of information via open source. You can do so much as an open source intelligence analyst. We're all actually open source intelligence analysts. If you Google something, like when you're on a trip, just trying to find something like a new restaurant, or a restaurant that's really good in a new place, you're doing open source intelligence. It sounds complicated, but we all are OSINT analysts to some extent. And the research never fully stops. Like, you're always asking questions, you're always changing your direction based on the requirements, based on what the information you find. So then you can actually come up with a report and basically find information for those people as well as just yourself. You need to ask questions. If you don't know something, you have to ask a different question, switch your perspective, and look up from there, and you can constantly find more information. But OSINT is contingent upon information sharing, because a lot of it is open source in the internet. If people aren't posting that on open source feeds or on the internet, we can't use it. So it's crucial for OSINT to have information sharing, both just globally as well as organizationally and within your own organization. And there's, contextualizing information obviously is a crucial aspect, because you have to understand the information, but you also have to understand the greater picture that it applies to. and that there's just a variety of applications for threat intelligence, you know, retrospective policy analysis, dynamic reports based on what customers need with like requests for information, threat landscapes, you know. There's so many applications to threat intelligence. It's not only just applicable to cybersecurity, but it's applicable to a variety of different industries across the globe. That it's just, this is kind of the tip of the iceberg of the things that I've shared today. That I am just one person, and what I've done and what I've seen is something that someone else probably has so much more information as well on what open source does and is, and what you can utilize threat intelligence for. It's just not constantly never ending. So there's so many applications for it, and it's just, this is just a key tiny bit of it that, you know, there's so much more. But thank you. Any questions?
Sorry, just a quick one. You were saying you do a lot of the research in Google. Is there a collaborative space where people collaborate and say, look, we've identified certain players or certain trends, or is it a case of you just Google everything, and hopefully you get lucky with their search?
Well, so there's a lot of companies that now have threat intelligence platforms, which basically is a centralized repository for a lot of that information for organizations to kind of research. But some of it is like you have to pay for it. It's subscription based, but a lot of those applications or companies do offer free, basically platforms that you can have access to use it for free. But as well as there's a variety of different forums and stuff you can find online. You know, Twitter is a massive one that people will constantly be sharing just bits and bobs of, hey, you know, I've noticed this bit of malware or this person's active, which then can spawn other researchers to kind of collaborate on that. That I've actually seen Twitter being quite massive and utilized often for a lot of information sharing when it comes to threat intelligence, especially related to cybersecurity. Thank you. Yeah?
You've got a Ukraine example.
Yes.
Obviously, they talk about Russia engaging in this new kind of cyber hybrid warfare.
Mm-hmm.
Is this something that we're able to defend against preemptively, or is it because it's so new, does some of it have to be reactive at some point as well? In terms of
that's a good question. A lot of it is reactive just inherently. But there are ways, and a lot of organizations and because of threat intelligence and a lot of the collaboration, we are able to become a bit more proactive. Especially within Russia, we've done, there's a lot of research globally on Russia's like state-sponsored threat groups and understanding what they do, so their tactics and how they get into organizations, how they propagate the entire cyber kill chain. We've become a bit more understanding of that process, as well as looking at some of their malwares and malware strains and utilizing these collaborative resources to share that information, so then organizations can kind of take that to be proactive. But there is a step to be proactive, and a lot of organizations have become more proactive, but inherently, as in cybersecurity and just in general, we're always going to be reactive to a sense, because there's always constant development and sophistication with malware, with threat actors, new ways of doing things. For them, they only have to find one new way to get into a system or to infiltrate someone or something. But we have to constantly protect against that, as well as against malware and viruses and stuff that we don't even know about because it hasn't been created yet. So there is a lot more of a step towards the proactive, but it's always going to be inherently reactive.
So what are you doing to prepare for like the next US election, for example? What does that look like?
For me personally, or just in general in cybersecurity?
Well, from like anomalies point of view, because I imagine you've got, based on what you were saying, for example, about Ukraine, that you've got something which has a lot of eyes on it, potential interference.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of something which is planned in advance in your team, or what typically kind of effort goes into preparing for that?
Well, so we've done we've done research and stuff upon the previous U.S. elections. It was the midterm elections, so that was when we became a bit more into it. Or looking at it because of the whole impact that the presidential elections had, especially with Russian influence. But right now, it's just us personally, but I've heard of other people as well that are using kind of the past to start researching already from even the midterm elections, looking at potential candidates and stuff to kind of see what, you know, type of squatting domains and stuff are there. Like, I'm not saying this is what we're doing specifically, but just in general, it's kind of led to a lot more looking at type of squatting, looking at phishing lures that are dealing with the elections, dealing with candidates, watering holes of already existing websites that might be, you know, infected to then infect those users who utilize it. Fake news is a big one as well, propagating a lot of false information and spreading that to then kind of impact the discourse. That it's a variety of things, but it's really just preemptive, like research and kind of just looking at what's happening. But there's only so much we can do, that it kind of comes down to the actual organizations to ensure that their own security is robust enough, as well as doing their own research on what their threats are. That external organizations are great, but organizations also need to be proactive about doing it for themselves. Does that really answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
So, having done research on past events, I like to identify, you know, where it went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Some actions are obvious, other actions not so much. Are there sort of methodologies or sort of general schools of thought that can be applied to research in order to drive actions from that at kind of organisational level?
Aye, so it's a good question, actually, really good question. So when it comes to the research, obviously some things aren't necessarily very obvious, but I think that means that maybe not necessarily frameworks, but you need a variety of researchers that have different outlooks and different strengths to do that research and do the analysis to then present a bit more of a robust kind of just full framework and full outlook to whoever needs it. For me personally, I don't necessarily know of a particular framework that's great. I utilize frameworks for my own research, but it's not necessarily geared towards the aftermath actions. It's looking at what's happening right now to then see what that would influence for the actions. But I think in general, it's just kind of, you need a broad outlook, but I don't necessarily have a methodology or a framework that I particularly use for that specifically, just because it kind of comes on a pragmatic ad hoc kind of basis, that what you find in one might not be the same for the other, but you might then use what you kind of found there, and it forms like, oh, well, I never thought about using that, so let me look at this when I'm doing this research, and that kind of might, you know, unveil something new that I never actually saw. So it's just kind of like the process of learning and kind of taking what you've learned and using that later. But I personally don't have anything, so I can't really be that helpful with that question. I'm sorry. I can do a bit more research though and get back to you though, because it's actually really interesting, and I would like to do a bit more into that. Yeah.
Kind of also, to answer that question, you need to have your threat model. Are you concerned, sort of, that a nation state will attack? Could you be a target of a nation state, for example? Or are you just concerned of making just
something more from an organisational point of view? So, for example, you said, you know, a lot of GP surgeries were out of action.
Mm-hmm.
They perhaps weren't aware that they needed to update them.
Yeah.
So perhaps I've done a little bit of research on the internet as a, you know, small business, and I'm aware that things have happened to other similar businesses, but it might not be obvious what I then need to do to you know, to prevent that from happening.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so perhaps something you can do at, you know, at a company level to sort of to take
Mm-hmm.
research and just, you know,
So it's
drive
actually,
actions.
Yeah.
supposed to be, or is to sharing within sort of your vertical, like your area. So, you know, for example, healthcare, provided that you sort of share. We've seen these kind of attacks against us. You may want to sort of take a look at this is what we have. So you share sort of your peers.
It just helped with some of the lessons learned of, hey, this happened to us, and this is how we kind of fixed it and mitigate, or not even mitigated it, but this are the remediations we took afterwards with our incident response and stuff. And so based on what happened to us, we don't want this to happen to you in the sector, so you maybe think about doing this instead. So yeah, ISACs are a good area, as well as just having very like informed incident response, as well as you know, red teaming and stuff. Try to find your own vulnerabilities before someone else does. Any other questions?
I think
Cool.
that's
Yeah, grand. Well, thank you, Gal. Appreciate it.